Gotham was a city under siege, with its bridges destroyed and its people cut off from the outside world. Despair ruled the streets. Bane's iron grip over the city grew tighter by the day. His militia patrolled with ruthless efficiency, enforcing his harsh laws and ensuring no one dared challenge his authority. The symbol of the city's hope, its protector, was broken. Far away, Bruce Wayne lay in the darkness of the pit. His back shattered and his spirit in ruins. He stared at the stone ceiling, haunted by the image of Bane lifting him and slamming him down like a toy. This is Gotham's reckoning, Bane's words echoed in his mind. Bruce clenched his fists, but his body refused to respond. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. Above the pit, the world moved on. Gotham's citizens, desperate for food and safety, scurried like rats to avoid Bane's soldiers. Catwoman, operating under the guise of Selina Kyle, moved through the shadows. She stole supplies from Bane's stores to keep small groups alive, but even she felt the weight of the city's hopelessness. "No one's coming to save us," she muttered to herself, pulling her coat tighter against the bitter wind. Not this time. In the heart of the city, Commissioner Gordon and Officer John Blake worked tirelessly to maintain some semblance of order. Gordon's injuries still slowed him, but his resolve was unshaken. "Bane thinks he's won," Gordon said, leaning against the ruined wall of the precinct, "but Gotham's stronger than he gives it credit for." Blake nodded grimly. "We can't keep this up much longer, though. Supplies are running out, and people are starting to turn on each other. Bane's militia isn't the only enemy anymore." Unbeknownst to Gotham's defenders, a new threat had already arrived. In the outskirts of the city, a brilliant flash of light lit up the night as a meteor tore through the atmosphere and struck the frozen wasteland outside Gotham. The ground trembled with the impact, sending shockwaves that even Bane's underground lair felt. At the crash site, the meteor smoldered, its surface cracked and glowing faintly. The warmth it emitted melted the surrounding snow, exposing strange, fleshy tendrils that began to emerge. Infection forms, small spider-like creatures with grotesque bulbous bodies, skittered out, their movements erratic yet purposeful. The flood had arrived. At first, the flood's spread was subtle. Hunters venturing near the crash site were the first to disappear. Days later, their distorted screams echoed in the night as they returned, not as men, but as combat forms, grotesque amalgamations of human flesh and flood biomass. They moved with terrifying speed, their clawed appendages tearing through anything in their path. Bane's soldiers were next. Patrols sent to investigate the outskirts began to dwindle, their members vanishing without a trace. When one soldier stumbled back into Gotham, his body covered in grotesque lesions, Bane ordered him quarantined. But it was already too late. By the next morning, the infected soldier's screams had turned to monstrous roars as he attacked his comrades, spreading the infection further. In the pit, Bruce Wayne pushed himself to stand. His body screamed in protest, his muscles weak from weeks of disuse. The old prisoner who had taken on the role of his mentor stood beside him, his expression unreadable. "Your city calls to you," the old man said in a low, gravelly voice. "Will you answer?" Bruce gritted his teeth, the weight of his failure heavy on his shoulders. "I've already failed them," he whispered. "Bane has won." The old man shook his head. "Bane is not the only danger your city faces. There is something worse now. Something far worse." He gestured to a makeshift radio, the faint static carrying fragments of desperate voices. "A new plague has taken root in Gotham. If you do not rise, no one will." Back in Gotham, Selina Kyle witnessed the flood's horror firsthand. Moving through the alleys, she stumbled upon a group of infected civilians. Their grotesque forms writhed and pulsed as they converged on a lone survivor. Selina watched in horror as the creatures overwhelmed the man, their tendrils piercing his body and twisting him into something inhuman. She backed away, her heart pounding. "What the hell is this?" she whispered, her instincts screaming at her to run. But she couldn't ignore the faint cries for help, echoing through the streets. With a deep breath, she stepped out of the shadows, using her agility and quick thinking to save a small group of survivors. In Bane's underground stronghold, the warlord's frustration grew. Reports of strange creatures decimating his ranks reached him daily, but he dismissed them as hysteria. "I am Gotham's reckoning," he declared to his lieutenants. "No parasite will challenge my dominion." Yet, as the days passed, Bane began to see the truth. His militia brought back infected prisoners, their twisted forms unrecognizable. When he questioned them, their responses were mindless growls and guttural screams. For the first time, Bane felt a flicker of unease. This was not a battle he understood. As the flood continued to spread, Gotham's already fragile society teetered on the brink of collapse. The infection reached the lower levels of the city, transforming entire neighborhoods into nightmarish hives. Gordon and Blake rallied what few uninfected officers remained, but their efforts felt futile. "Bane's men are falling just as fast as ours," Blake said, his voice shaking. "We're running out of time." Gordon gripped his sidearm tightly. "We hold the line," he said, though the words felt hollow. "We hold it until we can't." In the pit, Bruce Wayne finally found the strength to climb. His muscles burned, his breath came in ragged gasps, but he pressed on. Images of Gotham filled his mind, the people he had sworn to protect, the city that had given him purpose. He could not abandon them now. As he reached the top, the old man watched in silence. "You rise not for revenge," he said softly, "but for redemption." Bruce turned to face him, his jaw set. "I rise because Gotham needs me." The infection was no longer a secret. Gotham's streets echoed with the guttural roars of combat forms and the terrified screams of those who still resisted. The flood spread like wildfire, consuming neighborhoods and transforming once thriving areas into grotesque hives. Buildings were overtaken by fleshy biomass, their walls pulsating with alien growth. What remained of Bane's militia crumbled under the relentless assault. In his underground lair, Bane watched as a group of his soldiers dragged an infected prisoner into the chamber. The man's body twisted unnaturally, his eyes glowing faintly as tendrils writhed from his back. "What is this abomination?" Bane demanded, his voice calm but laced with menace. The infected man let out a guttural growl before lunging at Bane, his claws slicing through the air. With a swift motion, Bane caught the creature's arm and snapped it, throwing the infected to the ground. "You will tell me what you are," he growled. But the creature responded only with an inhuman roar. Despite his strength and dominance, Bane began to feel the weight of the flood. Reports of his soldiers falling to the infection came hourly, and the once disciplined ranks of his militia were now in chaos. "If this plague cannot be controlled, it will destroy everything we have built," Bane said to his lieutenants. But the lieutenants too were growing restless. Some had already begun to show signs of infection, subtle at first, strange twitching, unusual aggression. Others vanished entirely, only to return as grotesque combat forms, their minds overtaken by the flood. In the heart of the city, Selina Kyle guided a group of survivors through the infected zones. Her usual confidence was replaced by grim determination as she fought to keep the group alive. "Stay close and stay quiet," she whispered, peering around a corner where a group of combat forms prowled the streets. One of the survivors, a young boy, tugged at her sleeve. "Are the monsters going to eat us?" he asked, his voice trembling. Selina knelt to his level, her face softening. "Not if I can help it," she said, gripping her baton tightly. But as they moved, a low growl echoed from behind. A single combat form had spotted them, its glowing eyes narrowing. It let out a roar, alerting the others. Selina cursed under her breath. "Run!" she shouted, leading the group into the shadows. Meanwhile, Bruce Wayne emerged from the pit. His body ached, but his resolve was unbreakable. Clad in simple clothing, he made his way across the barren landscape, hitching rides and navigating treacherous terrain to reach Gotham. Along the way, he encountered refugees fleeing the city, their faces etched with terror. "Is it true?" Bruce asked one of them, a man whose arm was wrapped in a bloodied bandage. "The infection?" The man nodded, his eyes hollow. "It's not just people. It's the city itself. It's alive. You can't stop it." But Bruce's determination only grew. "I have to try," he said, stepping onto the broken bridge that led into Gotham. "I have to." By the time Bruce reached the city, it was barely recognizable. The skyline was obscured by strange pulsating growths, and the streets were littered with bodies, both human and inhuman. He made his way to Wayne Tower, where Lucius Fox had managed to keep a small group of engineers safe. "Mr. Wayne," Lucius said, his relief evident, "you're alive." "Barely," Bruce replied, his voice grim. "But this city isn't dead yet." Lucius led him to the tower's secure basement, where a makeshift command center had been set up. Monitors displayed footage of the infection spreading, and charts tracked the flood's growth. "We've been working on something," Lucius said, gesturing to a table filled with vials and equipment. "An experimental cure. It's incomplete, but it might buy us time." Before Bruce could respond, an alert blared across the monitors. "We have a breach," Lucius said, his voice tense. "The flood. They're here." Bruce donned his suit, the familiar weight of the cowl grounding him. "Then we stop them," he said, "no matter what." The first wave of infected broke through the tower's defenses, combat forms slamming into barricades and overwhelming the security team. Bruce fought with renewed vigor, his gadgets and martial prowess keeping the creatures at bay. But as he grappled with one combat form, its claws grazed his exposed arm, leaving a burning sensation in their wake. Bruce managed to defeat the creature, but as he stood, he noticed his vision blurring. His breath quickened and his hand trembled. "No," he whispered, clutching his arm. "Not now." Lucius rushed to his side, his eyes widening. "You've been infected," he said, fear creeping into his voice. Bruce steadied himself, his jaw tightening. "I can fight it. I don't have time to stop." Elsewhere in Gotham, Bane faced his own battle with the flood. After an ambush by a swarm of infection forms, he found himself cornered in an abandoned factory. Despite his strength, the creatures overwhelmed him, their tendrils piercing his body. Bane's roar of defiance echoed through the building, but it was cut short. The infection coursed through his veins, transforming his body into something monstrous. When he emerged, he was no longer fully Bane. His massive frame was twisted by the flood, his iconic mask fused with grotesque growths. Yet his mind retained a fragment of its former self. Flood Bane became a new threat to Gotham, leading the infected in coordinated assaults. His voice, distorted and guttural, echoed through the city. "Gotham is mine," he roared, his combat forms rallying to his side. "You will all kneel to the flood." The infected city grew darker, its people losing hope. But in Wayne Tower, Bruce Wayne refused to give in. Despite the infection taking hold of him, he pushed forward. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice steady. "Not while I'm still standing." Wayne Tower stood as one of the few strongholds left in Gotham. its walls fortified with what little technology and manpower remained. Inside, Bruce Wayne clutched his arm where the flood's infection had taken root. The veins around the wound pulsed with a faint, sickly glow, and his body felt heavier with each passing moment. Yet, his resolve did not waver. Lucius Fox handed Bruce a vial filled with a glowing liquid. "This is the stabilizer I've been working on," Lucius said, his voice steady but grim. "It won't cure you, but it might slow the infection, at least long enough for us to find a way to stop it." Bruce nodded, injecting the stabilizer into his arm without hesitation. The burning sensation subsided slightly, but he could feel the flood's influence gnawing at his mind. His thoughts became fragmented, and whispers echoed in his head. "I don't have much time," he said, his voice strained. "We need to act now." Selina Kyle arrived at the tower with a small group of survivors, her face pale but determined. "The flood is everywhere," she said, tossing down a makeshift map. "They've overtaken half the city. And Bane..." Her voice trailed off. Bruce's jaw tightened. "He's alive?" Selina hesitated. "Alive isn't the word I'd use. He's changed. He's leading them, Bruce, coordinating their attacks. Whatever's left of him, it's not human." Lucius interjected. "If Bane is controlling the flood in Gotham, he's likely become a nexus for the infection. If we can take him out, it might destabilize the local outbreak." Bruce stared at the map, his mind racing. "Then we need to stop him before the infection spreads beyond Gotham." Outside, the flood continued to overrun the city. Combat forms stalked the streets, their grotesque shapes illuminated by the eerie glow of the biomass spreading across buildings. Carrier forms lumbered through the ruins, bursting into swarms of infection forms that latched onto anything living. Commissioner Gordon and John Blake led small groups of civilians to safety, but their numbers dwindled with each passing hour. "This is getting worse," Gordon said, his voice hoarse. "We're running out of places to hide." Blake adjusted his rifle, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We can't keep running. We need to fight back." Bruce, Selina, and Lucius formulated a plan. The Wayne Enterprises R&D lab housed an experimental energy weapon designed for industrial purposes, but capable of delivering a concentrated blast of heat and radiation. "It's not perfect," Lucius said, "but if we can get it close enough to the source of the infection, it might destroy it." Selina raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly do we get close enough to Bane? He's surrounded by an army of monsters." "I'll distract them," Bruce said, his voice resolute. "I can still fight." Selina shot him a skeptical look. "You're infected, Bruce. How long before you turn into one of them?" "As long as it takes," he replied, donning his cowl. "I won't let Gotham fall." The team split into two groups. Lucius and Selina would transport the weapon through the underground tunnels, avoiding the flood's main horde. Bruce would lead a direct assault, drawing Bane's forces away from the weapon's path. Commissioner Gordon and Blake coordinated a distraction to buy them time. As Bruce stepped into the streets, the infection tugged at his mind. The whispers grew louder, urging him to join the flood. "You cannot resist," the voices said, their tones seductive yet chilling. "You will be one with us." Bruce clenched his fists, his breath steady. Not today. The first wave of combat forms descended upon him, their grotesque bodies lunging with inhuman speed. Batman fought with brutal efficiency, his gadgets and combat skills keeping the creatures at bay. Explosive batarangs tore through clusters of infected, while his upgraded suit absorbed blows that would have killed an ordinary man. But the flood's numbers were overwhelming. For every combat form he defeated, more took its place. Bruce's movements slowed as the infection sapped his strength, but he pushed forward, his mind focused on the mission. In the tunnels, Selina and Lucius navigated through the darkness, the weapon humming faintly as they moved. "I hope he knows what he's doing," Selina said, her voice betraying her concern. "He always does," Lucius replied, though his expression was grim. "But this time, I'm not sure even he can win." As they neared their target, the ground trembled. The walls of the tunnel began to warp, covered in the pulsating biomass of the flood. "We're close," Lucius said. "Too close." Above ground, Bruce confronted Flood Bane for the first time. The monstrous figure towered over him, its body a grotesque fusion of muscle and alien growths. Bane's iconic mask was now a permanent part of his face, fused with the Flood's biomass. "Wayne," Bane growled, his voice distorted but still recognizable. "You should have stayed in the pit." Bruce raised his fists. "Gotham isn't yours." Bane laughed, a guttural, horrifying sound. "Gotham belongs to the Flood now, and soon so will you." The two clashed, their battle shaking the ruined streets. Bane's strength was monstrous, his movements faster and more brutal than ever. Bruce countered with precision and ingenuity, using every trick in his arsenal to stay alive. But the infection in Bruce's body continued to weaken him. His vision blurred, and his reflexes dulled. Bane noticed, his grotesque grin widening. "You're already one of us," he taunted. "Why fight it?" In the tunnels, Selina and Lucius reached their destination, the heart of the Flood's hive. The weapon hummed to life, its glow illuminating the grotesque chamber. "This will work," Lucius said, adjusting the controls. "But we need to hold them off until it's fully charged." Selina nodded, readying her weapons. "Then let's make it count." Bruce, battered and bleeding, managed to outmaneuver Bane, using a grappling hook to pull himself to higher ground. "You'll have to do better than that," he said, his voice strained but defiant. Bane roared, leaping after him. "You are nothing, Wayne. Just a man in a mask." Bruce smirked. "Sometimes that's enough." Wayne Tower was bathed in an eerie glow, as the Flood's biomass crept closer, pulsating with life. The hive's grotesque tendrils stretched toward the makeshift barricades, each inching forward with relentless determination. Inside the tunnels below, Selina Kyle and Lucius Fox worked frantically to charge the experimental weapon. Its hum grew louder, signaling that it was nearly ready. "This has to work," Selina muttered, her eyes darting toward the tunnel entrance. The ground trembled, and the air was thick with the distant roars of combat forms. "Because we're out of options." Lucius adjusted the weapon's settings, his hands steady despite the chaos. "If Bruce can hold Bane off long enough, we'll have a shot at stopping this," he said. "But this isn't just about destroying the hive. This blast will hit every infected life form in the city." Selina glanced at him, realization dawning. "Every infected life form," she repeated, "including him." Lucius didn't answer. He didn't have to. Above ground, the battle between Batman and Floodbane raged on. The once proud warlord had become an unrecognizable monster, his body a grotesque blend of muscle, bone, and Flood biomass. Despite his infection, fragments of Bane's tactical mind remained, making him a cunning and ferocious adversary. "You fight for nothing, Wayne," Bane growled, his voice distorted but still menacing. "The Flood is inevitable. We are perfection." Bruce dodged a swipe of Bane's massive claw, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The infection in his own body had spread further, his movements sluggish and his vision blurred. The whispers in his mind grew louder, urging him to surrender. But Bruce pressed on, his will unshaken. "Perfection," Bruce spat, his voice filled with defiance. "You're nothing but a parasite, and I've had enough of parasites." The streets around Wayne Tower were a battlefield. Combat forms swarmed from every direction, their claws ripping through anything in their path. Commissioner Gordon and John Blake led A, desperate defense. Their small group of survivors armed with what little remained of Gotham's arsenal. "Hold the line," Gordon shouted, firing his shotgun at an oncoming combat form. "We can't let them get to the tower." Blake reloaded his rifle, sweat dripping from his brow. "We're running out of ammo," he called back, his voice strained, "and they're not slowing down." The ground shook violently as more carrier forms exploded, releasing waves of infection forms. The survivors fought valiantly, but their numbers were dwindling. Every second they bought was another second for Batman and Selina to finish the mission. In the tunnels, the weapon finally reached full charge. Its core glowed brightly, illuminating the chamber with an intense light. Lucius stepped back, his face grim. "It's ready." Selina nodded, her grip tightening on her baton. "Now we just have to keep them off us until Bruce gets here." But as the first wave of combat forms descended into the tunnels, it became clear that time was running out. Selina fought with unmatched ferocity, her strikes precise and calculated. Lucius held his ground, using a makeshift flamethrower to keep the creatures at bay. But the flood's numbers were overwhelming. Above, Bruce and Bane's fight reached its peak. Bane lunged at Bruce with monstrous speed, his claws narrowly missing their mark. Batman countered with a grappling hook, pulling himself onto a ledge for a moment's respite. "You cannot win, Wayne," Bane snarled, his distorted voice echoing through the ruins. "You are already one of us." Bruce glanced at his trembling hand, the veins dark and pulsing with the infection. His vision blurred again, and for a moment, he saw himself as one of them, another mindless, monstrous flood form. But he shook the image from his mind, focusing on the mission. "You're wrong," he said, dropping down to face Bane one last time. "I don't fight to win. I fight because Gotham needs me." Bruce's assault was unrelenting. Using every last ounce of his strength, he landed a series of blows that staggered Bane. His fists struck with a fury fueled by desperation, each hit pushing the monstrous warlord closer to the edge. Finally, with one last strike, Bruce sent Bane crashing into the biomass below. The flood around them paused, as if sensing their leader's defeat. Bruce staggered, his strength nearly gone. He pressed a button on his wrist communicator, signaling to Selina and Lucius. "Do it," he said, his voice weak but resolute. In the tunnels, Lucius hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the activation switch. "Once we start this, there's no going back," he said, his voice heavy with regret. Selina placed a hand on his shoulder. "He knows what he's doing," she said quietly. "Do it." Lucius activated the weapon. The chamber filled with a blinding light as the energy built to critical levels. The hum grew into a deafening roar, and the flood surged toward them in a final, desperate attack. Bruce, standing amidst the infected streets, felt the stabilizer in his body begin to fail. The infection surged, and the whispers in his mind turned into a deafening cacophony. He fell to his knees, his body trembling as the flood tried to take control. But even in his final moments, Bruce's will remained unbroken. "Gotham is worth it," he whispered, his eyes closing as the weapon's energy engulfed the city. The blast erupted from Wayne Tower, a wave of energy that tore through the flood's biomass. Combat forms disintegrated, carrier forms burst into ash, and the hive itself collapsed in on itself. The light consumed everything infected, including Bruce. When the light faded, Gotham was silent. The city lay in ruins, but the flood was gone. Survivors emerged from their hiding places, their faces etched with shock and grief. Commissioner Gordon stood in the wreckage of the barricades, his shotgun lowered. "It's over," he said quietly. Selina and Lucius emerged from the tunnels, their expressions heavy with loss. "He did it," Selina said, her voice trembling. "He saved us." In the aftermath, a makeshift memorial was erected in the ruins of Wayne Tower. Gordon stood before the crowd, his voice breaking as he spoke. "Bruce Wayne gave everything for this city. He was more than just a man in a mask. He was a symbol, and that symbol will live on." The bat signal faintly visible through the haze. Bruce's sacrifice had saved the city, but his legacy endured as a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, the light of hope could never be extinguished.